In the suffocating heat of the Vietnamese jungle, silence was never neutral. For most soldiers, it signaled imminent danger. A jungle too quiet meant ambush. But for a rare breed of men, silence was not a warning. It was a mission objective. It was the very definition of survival. While the conventional American war machine stormed across Vietnam with thundering helicopters, roaring jet engines, and the earth-shaking violence of artillery fire, another war unfolded in complete quiet. It was a parallel conflict, invisible to most and deadly in its own right. There were no battalions here, no platoons marching in formation across rice paddies. Instead, 4 or 6 men would vanish into dense, enemy-infested jungle, alone, unsupported, and largely forgotten. These men were part of a secretive force known as the Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrols, or LRRPs, pronounced LRRPs. They didn't go out to fight the enemy. They went out to find him, and to do so without ever being seen. To understand why such units existed, we must first understand the failure of conventional tactics in Vietnam. American infantry doctrine emphasized large-scale sweep operations intended to draw out the enemy and force decisive engagements. Hundreds of soldiers, backed by tanks and artillery, would move through a sector looking for contact. But time and again, their targets, whether Viet Cong guerrillas or North Vietnamese regulars, simply disappeared. The Vietnamese enemies controlled the timing and location of most engagements. They attacked when they wanted, melted away when they didn't. The massive U.S. sweeps became exercises in frustration, like swinging a sledgehammer at smoke. They made noise, caused destruction, but often yielded no enemy contact. American commanders called it fighting blind. They had superior firepower, but no eyes to guide it. That's where the LRRPs came in. These patrols were conceived as the eyes and ears of the division. Small teams operating deep in enemy territory, gathering real-time intelligence on troop movements, infiltration routes, base areas, and ambush positions. Their job wasn't to kill, but to watch. Not to engage, but to report. Their success was measured not in enemy bodies, but in how completely invisible they remained. A successful LRP mission ended without a single shot fired, without a broken twig, without so much as a trace left behind. Their only evidence was a report, coordinates, observations, intercepted radio traffic. But those fragments of intelligence would often save hundreds of lives by preventing an ambush or directing a B-52 strike onto an enemy staging area. But these were no ordinary patrols. Where a regular infantry platoon consisted of 40 to 60 men and a company could number over 100, the standard LRP team was just 4 to 6 individuals, each carrying their own body weight in equipment, each trained to survive in total isolation. There was no cavalry coming if things went wrong, no tanks, no reinforcements, sometimes not even air support. They operated dozens of kilometers behind enemy lines, in some of the most dangerous terrain in the war, places where even the Green Berets rarely went. These were not suicide missions, but they required accepting long odds. Being outnumbered 50 to 1 was standard. Contact with the enemy didn't just risk injury, it risked annihilation. Their very existence required a new kind of soldier. Not the clean-cut parade ground trooper, but men who could disappear, mentally and physically, into the jungle. Men who were more comfortable moving in silence than shouting orders. Who could lie motionless for hours in leech-infested mud, surrounded by enemy patrols and not move a muscle. They were ghosts, and they knew it. They didn't wear standard-issue uniforms. They wore tiger-striped camouflage, often unauthorized. They rejected steel helmets and flak vests in favor of soft bush hats that allowed them to hear better and stay low. Their rucksacks bulged not with comfort items, but with radios, batteries, maps, and ammunition. They didn't march. They glided. They advanced inch by inch, sometimes covering less than 300 meters in an entire day. Every movement was calculated. A misplaced step, the crack of a twig, even a cough could compromise the mission and cost them their lives. In Vietnam, there was war in the headlines. And then there was the silent war in the shadows. The LRRPs belonged to the latter. They were not there for glory or for medals. They were there because someone had to see what no one else could. Someone had to step into the dark, unarmed with anything but discipline, skill, and trust in the man beside them. This was their world, a war of whispers, of watching without being seen, of holding your breath while the enemy walked past your hiding place, close enough to count the buttons on his shirt. And for these men, that silence wasn't just golden. It was everything. You couldn't draft a man into the long-range reconnaissance patrols. You couldn't force someone to become a ghost. The job was too dangerous, too demanding, and far too lonely. Every LRRP soldier was a volunteer, and not just in name. They chose this life knowing exactly what it meant. No backup, no safety net, and no guarantees. When General William Westmoreland issued the directive in early 1966 for divisions to form dedicated long-range patrol units, the call went out across Vietnam, and not with the usual recruiting slogans. There was no mention of glory or honor. Instead, it was simple and stark. We need men who can read a map, handle a radio, move silently, and stay alive. The soldiers who stepped forward weren't always the polished poster boys of military discipline. Many were misfits, the kind of men who didn't quite fit in with traditional units. Some had been disciplinary problems. Others were simply tired of filling sandbags and shining boots in the rear. They were drawn to the idea of doing something real, something that mattered, where skill meant more than spit-shine shoes or chain-of-command formalities. In the LRRPs, nobody cared if your hair was regulation length or your boots were polished. What mattered was whether you could navigate dense jungle in total darkness, stay perfectly still for hours, and pull the trigger only when it absolutely counted. Precision, patience, and silence became the true markers of excellence. But volunteering was only the beginning. To become a LRRP, you had to be rebuilt from the ground up. That process began at one of the most rigorous training programs in theater, the Massive Recondo School in Nha Trang. This wasn't a classroom filled with theory and chalkboards. It was a crucible, an unforgiving gauntlet of exhaustion, fear, and pain designed to burn away bad habits and replace them with instincts. Instructors were often Special Forces veterans who'd already survived the worst that jungle warfare could offer. Their teaching philosophy was blunt. In the bush, a mistake doesn't get you a bad grade. It gets you killed. The training was brutal and unrelenting. Recruits ran long distances in the blazing tropical heat, repelled from helicopters, and learned to call in artillery strikes with mathematical precision. They were taught the anatomy of ambushes, how to detect signs of enemy movement, how to move in absolute silence, and how to function with no sleep, no comfort, and no promise of extraction. But the most critical part of the training wasn't physical, it was psychological. In conventional infantry school, you're taught to close with and destroy the enemy, to assault, to overwhelm, to engage. But in Recondo school, that instinct had to be unlearned. Pulling the trigger meant failure. If you were shooting, it usually meant the mission had gone sideways. The entire ethos of the LRRPs revolved around not being seen. They weren't killers first. They were hunters and observers, trained to study the jungle as if it were a living thing, to sense its rhythm, to know when something was out of place. If combat came, it had to be brief, brutal, and surgical, because the enemy was rarely far and reinforcements were never close. The final test of Recondo training wasn't theoretical. It wasn't simulated. It was a live patrol in enemy territory. The students were inserted by helicopter into hostile jungle with real ammunition and real enemies nearby. It wasn't a drill. If they came back alive, they passed. That experience bonded them in ways that even they struggled to articulate. A six-man LRP team wasn't just a group of soldiers. It was a single organism, each man a critical nerve or muscle. Trust wasn't optional. It was existential. The point man was the team's eyes, scanning the ground for tripwires, traps, and enemy signs. The radio operator, often called the RTO, was the team's voice to the outside world, the lifeline to artillery, extraction, or air support. The rear security man guarded the trail behind, always walking backward, always watching for signs they were being followed. Every member was essential. Every mistake was fatal. They learned a new language, the language of silence. Hand signals replaced voices. A single gesture could mean halt, danger, or change direction. Speaking was reserved for whispers, and only when absolutely necessary. Even breathing was something to control. And when the team was finally formed and fully trained, their war began with the sound of rotor blades beating over the treetops. The familiar thump of a Huey helicopter was the start of every mission. a ride that carried them over the fire bases, over the rivers, into the vast green unknown. They'd tape down every piece of gear before takeoff. No rattling allowed. Dog tags were taped or stuffed in boots, canteens secured, ammo magazines checked for creaks. Even the springs were silenced. Every detail mattered, because once the helicopter flared and they dropped into the elephant grass, they were on their own. And then, the jungle swallowed them whole. The noise of the war faded, the silence returned. The mission had begun. The jungle wasn't just the battlefield, it was the enemy. Every leaf, every vine, every half-submerged root was a trap waiting to break a man's silence. In this green cathedral of sound and shadow, long-range reconnaissance patrols didn't march. They didn't walk. They moved like ghosts, step by agonizing step, every footfall a decision, every breath a risk. Once inserted into the field, typically by helicopter, the team's first moments on the ground were always the most dangerous. The landing zone, or LZ, could be booby-trapped, watched, or ambushed. To complicate matters, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong had learned to anticipate helicopter insertions, often stationing trail watchers near clearings or dispatching patrols to investigate. To counter this, teams frequently conducted false insertions, briefly touching down in multiple locations before the real drop, designed to confuse enemy spotters. But even so, the LRRPs never assumed they were safe. Once on the ground, the team would immediately disperse into a tight 360-degree defensive perimeter. Every weapon pointed out, every man listening, scanning. No one moved. For 30 to 60 minutes, they would sit in absolute silence, just listening to the jungle breathe. And they knew the difference between its normal breath and a disturbed one. A broken twig could mean an animal or an enemy scout. A sudden silence in bird calls might indicate nearby movement. A monkey's screech could be a natural sound, or a coded signal used by Viet Cong to indicate an American presence. LRRP teams had to develop an almost superhuman level of auditory sensitivity, trained to distinguish natural sounds from human-made ones. Only when the team leader, often the most experienced member, was fully convinced they hadn't been compromised would the patrol begin moving. But movement was never casual. It was a performance of precision, rehearsed, refined, and obsessively disciplined. The patrol advanced in single file, each man responsible for a specific direction of observation. The point man watched the trail ahead, eyes peeled for mines, tripwires, or signs of ambush. The second man scanned the left flank, the next the right. The rear security often walked backwards, watching the team's trail for pursuit, snipers, or signs they were being tracked. No one spoke. Communication was conducted entirely through hand signals, a silent language of clenched fists, pointed fingers, and waved palms. A raised fist meant stop. A circling finger pointed out direction. A flat hand slicing across the chest meant danger ahead. Speed was never the objective. In fact, slowness was survival. A good team might cover only 200 meters per hour in dense terrain. Some days they moved less than a kilometer total. Every root and step was examined before weight was applied. Every vine could be a wire. Every patch of moss might cover a pit. And through all of this, they carried weight. Staggering weight. Each man bore 60 to 70 pounds of gear, and often more. The PRC-25 radio alone weighed over 20 pounds, and that didn't include spare batteries. Another 15. Then came ammunition. Hundreds of rounds of M16 magazines, belts for an M60 if they carried one, grenades of every type, fragmentation, white phosphorus, CS gas, smoke, claymore mines, trip flares, extra socks, ropes, medical kits, strobe lights, signal panels. Water was constant dead weight, but a vital one. 3 to 5 quarts per man was the standard load, but it evaporated quickly in the suffocating heat. In dry season, water became an obsession. Teams would drink from bomb craters filled with brown sludge, treating it with iodine tablets that made the water taste like chlorine and metal. And yet the jungle gave nothing for free. Leeches waited in the brush, writhing into boots, crawling under uniforms, and lodging into ears and groins. The trick was to burn them off, never pull, lest the head break off and cause infection. The soldiers wrapped pant legs with rigger's tape to slow them down, but the leeches always found a way in. Then there were the insects, mosquitoes, fire ants, hornets, and the near-microscopic trumbiculid mites that cause scrub typhus. Jungle rot took hold of feet, groins, armpits, anywhere moisture sat too long. Skin peeled away, wounds festered, all of it endured in silence. At night, teams chose a tentative harbor site, a thick patch of vegetation or the base of a hill, and watched it from a distance. Only at last light did they move in, forming a tight circular perimeter. The radio was centrally placed. Touch contact was essential, so each man could reach out in the dark and tap the next. They didn't speak. They barely slept. Half the team remained awake at all times, rotating silently. If sleep came at all, it came in shallow bursts, half-conscious vigilance, weapons clutched to chests, eyes half-lidded, but ears always alert. Some soldiers never truly slept in the jungle. They merely rested in a heightened state of tension, ready to kill or run at a moment's notice. The silence was more than a tactic. It was their shield, their weapon, their camouflage, their prayer. The slightest sound could bring death. The mission was not to fight. The mission was to not be seen. And that required a kind of patience, discipline, and mental focus that bordered on the inhuman. For long-range reconnaissance patrols, breaking silence was not a tactic. It was a crisis. The crack of a rifle, the blast of a claymore mine, or the frantic hiss of a radio under duress signaled that something had gone wrong or something had begun. They were not built for extended firefights. 6 men against 60 was the average, and most teams were operating deep in NVA-controlled territory with no armored support, no reinforcements, and often no nearby artillery. If a LRRP team opened fire, it was with the full knowledge that they had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the enemy responded in force. Still, some missions demanded it, ambush missions the kill zone. While most patrols focused on reconnaissance and reporting, certain missions were deliberately aggressive. Ambushes planned at known enemy choke points or trail intersections. The LRRPs would move into position just before dusk, pick a slight rise or curve in the trail, and begin setting up. They planted claymore mines, explosives packed with 700 steel ball bearings each, at staggered intervals, daisy-chained together with wire. These weren't randomly placed. The arc of coverage was calculated, the detonation wires carefully run back to the central position where the team leader waited, watching through thick vegetation. Then came the hardest part, the waiting. For hours, sometimes all night, they lay still, muscles cramping, insects crawling into sleeves and mouths, sweat pooling inside boots. Every sound in the jungle was a potential target. A broken branch, a faint voice, the crunch of a sandal on dry leaves. And eventually they came. NVA patrols, usually small squads, would move down the trail, oblivious to what lay ahead. As they entered the kill zone, the team leader would wait until the optimal moment, when the highest concentration of enemy soldiers was exposed, then detonate the claymores. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Steel balls tore through the jungle at 4,000 feet per second, turning air into shrapnel. Screams, chaos, blood. Then the LRRPs opened fire. Not randomly, short controlled bursts, aimed with deadly calm. The entire ambush lasted less than 30 seconds. The team would then charge into the chaos, snatching maps, documents, weapons, anything that could yield intelligence. If they were lucky, they might grab a prisoner. Prisoner snatches, violence in the dark. These were among the most dangerous assignments. Capturing a live enemy. A dead body could reveal much. A live one could tell everything. The team would identify a high-value target. Often the second or third man in a patrol, someone carrying a pistol or wearing a map case. That man was usually a squad leader, political officer, or courier. When the ambush detonated, 2 designated rangers would burst from cover, tackling the target in hand-to-hand combat, binding and gagging him while the rest of the team laid down suppressive fire. Dragging a kicking, terrified prisoner through the jungle was a nightmare. He slowed the team. He could scream, he could resist, and most dangerously, he might have been missed by his comrades who would come searching, armed and furious. Break contact, fighting while fleeing. Not every encounter was planned. Sometimes an NVA scout would stumble onto a LRRP perimeter. A snapped twig, a glint of reflected sunlight, a hint of movement, and suddenly the ghosts of the jungle were being hunted. When compromised, the break contact drill kicked in. The point man fired his weapon, a grenade, a burst, anything to cause confusion, and moved. The next man did the same, leapfrogging past him as the team bounded backward under fire. It was a choreographed retreat, rehearsed endlessly. One man moved while the others fired, then roles switched, over and over again until they reached distance or a clearing. All the while, the RTO screamed into the handset, calling for air support, gunships, or artillery. If there was a nearby fire base, they might get a barrage dropped in front of them to block pursuit. If not, they ran for extraction. Emergency extraction, the skyhook to safety. But not every jungle had a clearing. In many cases, the team had to call for a hovering extraction, a helicopter unable to land, forced to drop down McGuire rigs. Long ropes with harnesses tied to the ends. One by one, the Rangers clipped in and were lifted vertically through the canopy, swinging in the air like puppets while door gunners sprayed the jungle below to keep heads down. It was terrifying, vulnerable, exposed. Some men were shot mid-air, some fell, some were cut loose to save the helicopter. But the alternative, capture, was worse. They preferred to die in the air, in the open, rather than be dragged into a bamboo cage and tortured for weeks. When silence returned, and then, just like that, it would be over. The Huey disappeared into the sky. The jungle was left scorched and empty. A torn trail of footprints, blood, and burnt leaves marked where men had vanished again. The LRRPs weren't just observers. When the time came, they became hunters, executioners, and shadows with teeth. They didn't want a firefight. But when it came, they fought with precision, aggression, and the desperate urgency of men who knew they were already outnumbered. Because for them, war wasn't a matter of if the silence would break. It was a matter of how fast they could disappear again once it did. For the long-range reconnaissance patrols, the enemy wasn't just wearing a uniform. It didn't always carry an AK-47 or move in formation. Sometimes the enemy was the jungle itself, relentless, rotting, alive. Every patrol was a test of endurance, but not just the kind measured in distance or combat. The jungle of Vietnam was hot beyond reason. Humidity smothered everything. Sweat soaked through clothes before sunrise. By noon, it was as if the air had weight, pressing down on lungs, sticking to skin, leaching strength from the body with every step. Water was life, and water was never enough. Each man carried at least 3 to 5 quarts, but in the dry season, even that disappeared fast. They'd run out, then search for puddles, bomb craters, or trickling streams. They'd scoop up brown liquid, thick with sediment and insect larvae, and drop iodine tablets into it, turning filth into something just barely drinkable, something that wouldn't kill them immediately. During the wet season, water was everywhere, and so were the leeches. They waited in tall grass and swampy trails, dropped from leaves like living needles, slid into boots, under collars, even into ears and groins. You didn't feel them at first. They numbed the skin. But after a few hours, blood pooled around socks and cuffs. To remove them, you burned them with a cigarette or dabbed insect repellent. Pulling them off by hand often left the head embedded and the wound infected. The jungle never stopped taking. Feet rotted inside damp socks and boots. Trench foot and jungle rot turned toes gray. Skin peeled away, and open sores refused to heal. Red welts blossomed into raw ulcers. Between the legs, under the arms, across the chest, wherever sweat collected and air never reached. Every step was pain, every movement a reminder that they were slowly breaking down, piece by piece. Diseases hit just as hard as bullets. Scrub typhus, malaria, hepatitis, and parasitic infections weren't rare. They were routine. Men spiked fevers of 104 degrees in the middle of nowhere. Diarrhea left them dehydrated, shaking in the undergrowth. Sometimes they couldn't walk. Sometimes they had to be carried. Sometimes they didn't come back. Snakes curled under leaves and waited. The green pit viper, the dreaded cigarette snake, was said to kill you in 2 steps, or however long it took to smoke one last cigarette. Cobras, banded kraits, and bamboo vipers were common in the Central Highlands. Most bites weren't fatal, but miles from help, even non-lethal venom could end a mission. Then there were the insects. Mosquitoes by the thousands. Fire ants that swarmed legs in seconds. wasps that built nests in the underbrush, ready to attack at the brush of a boot. Entire missions were aborted because a man stumbled into a hornet's nest, and the team spent hours swatting and cursing while the jungle echoed with noise. And still, silence was demanded. No yelling, no moaning. A man with infected feet still had to walk. A man with a high fever still had to pull security. There was no backup, no relief. If you couldn't move, the team moved without you. If you made noise, everyone died. Even sleep turned against them. They couldn't sleep properly. Half the team was always awake. The rest drifted into a half-conscious twilight. Weapons across their chests, fingers near the trigger. They twitched at every rustle. Ceiling fans back in the rear bases sounded like rotor blades. Dreams weren't rest. They were replays of insertion zones, of footsteps on the trail, of enemies so close you could smell their breath. Some carried amphetamines, little green pills issued quietly by medics, meant to keep men awake and alert during 24, 48, even 72-hour stretches. No one talked about it, but when the second night came and your eyes closed against your will, the pill was the difference between staying sharp or dying in your sleep. The psychological pressure was beyond measure. Imagine sitting motionless in a thicket, covered in mud, blood, sweat, and insect bites, while enemy soldiers pass just a few feet away. You can hear their boots, smell their sweat. You don't breathe. You don't blink. You wonder if this is it, if they'll spot the shine on your rifle barrel or hear your heartbeat pounding like drums in your ears. You don't move. And if you survive that moment, you don't celebrate. You just keep moving, silently, slowly, suffering. Because there were no breaks, no safe zones. The jungle never stopped pressing in. It degraded gear, infected skin, corrupted minds. And still, the mission demanded that you observe, record, report, and return unseen. The enemy tried to kill you, but the jungle, it tried to eat you alive. They weren't always alone in the jungle. Some teams had an extra man, not American, not dressed like them, not fully trusted, but absolutely vital. A Kit Carson scout. He was often quiet, wiry, and moved through the brush like he was born in it. His eyes scanned the trail with a different rhythm. He heard things others didn't. He smelled things others couldn't. He knew the land, the language, the enemy. He used to be one of them. Kit Carson's scouts were former Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldiers who had defected under the Chiu Hoi program. They came over with stories, scars, and years of experience, fighting the very war LRRPs were now wading into blind. These men had once planted booby traps, patrolled jungle paths, and lived in tunnels. Now they walked point for American recon teams. Some Rangers hated the idea. Trust didn't come easy in six-man teams. One weak link could kill everyone. And here was a man who, weeks or months ago, might have been trying to kill them. But over time, the results silenced doubt. The scouts saved lives. They could smell rice cooking before anyone else noticed the wind shift. They could tell if birds had gone quiet because of a tiger or an ambush. They examined bent grass, fresh ash, or a discarded twig and told you how many enemy passed, how long ago, what direction, and whether they'd return. They didn't guess. They knew. They listened to the jungle like it was speaking to them. Where an American soldier might see just trees, the scouts saw signs. Footprints, drag marks, unnatural silence, fake brush cover, hidden spider holes. They recognized worn paths that had been disguised, caches of supplies buried near creek beds, or the subtle way the jungle smelled different after a unit moved through. Some could tell which unit it was based on the type of food wrapper left behind. They rarely spoke unless asked. Their job wasn't to lead or command. It was to guide, to alert, to keep the team alive. They walked at the front where danger lived. And when things went bad, they didn't run. They fought alongside the Rangers like men with nothing left to lose. In one patrol, a Kit Carson scout stopped the team mid-step, sniffed the air, and pointed to a clump of leaves. Beneath it, the team found a narrow trail leading into a hidden bunker complex, not on any map, not visible from the air. Another time, a scout paused, sniffed again, and whispered a single word: fish sauce. The enemy had passed by hours earlier, but the smell still lingered on their breath, caught in the brush. The team called in air support. Minutes later, the jungle exploded. They weren't always welcomed by everyone. Some American officers didn't trust them. Some soldiers refused to sleep near them. But in the bush, when you're 100 miles from the nearest base and the trees are filled with men trying to kill you, politics disappears. What matters is who brings you home. And the scouts did. They also translated. They eavesdropped on enemy conversations from hidden positions. They read captured documents, intercepted orders. They whispered insights others missed. Sometimes they even recognized voices. Former commanders, comrades, men they once fought beside. It wasn't easy for them. They were traitors to their own people. If caught, they were tortured and executed, slowly. There were bounties on their heads. Some carried letters in their pockets, written to their families, knowing they might never see them again. Others carried nothing at all. They didn't ask for medals. Most didn't even use their real names. But the Rangers remembered them. Years later, in reunions and after-action discussions, their stories surfaced again and again. The scout who dragged a wounded RTO through a minefield. The one who spotted an NVA platoon before the team walked into the kill zone. The one who refused extraction so the rest of the team could make it out faster. They were ghosts walking beside ghosts, neither fully American nor truly NVA anymore. Caught between sides, they chose survival. They chose loyalty to the men they walked beside. And in doing so, they became something else. Bridges between two worlds. In a war filled with betrayal, confusion, and blurred lines, they brought clarity. And in a jungle where most Americans were deaf, they helped the LRRPs hear. Time moved differently in the jungle. Days were not marked by sunrises or sunsets, but by battery changes, position shifts, and scheduled radio checks. For LRRP teams, each hour was measured in silence, in sweat, in the weight of the pack digging into shoulders, in the sound of breath held for too long. The rhythm of a patrol was slow, deliberate, repetitive. Wake before dawn, observe, move cautiously, stop, listen, move again. At noon, both sides often paused. The NVA took midday rest periods. American teams did the same, not for comfort, but survival. Moving during siesta hours risked walking into a dug-in position. They'd find cover, tighten the perimeter, and go still. Radios came out. Attempts were made to reach base. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The thick jungle canopy, the ridgelines and weather all played against them. The PRC-25 radios, standard issue, were unreliable in the extreme terrain. Signals vanished, batteries died, humidity shorted out components. The handset would crackle with static, or worse, go silent. They built antennas in the field, stretching wires into trees using parachute cord, trying to get enough elevation to bounce a signal off a nearby hill or into a relay station. Every situation report, every coordinates update was hard-earned. The radio was the lifeline. Without it, they were cut off, drifting alone in enemy territory. When the radio failed, the mission changed. It became survival first. Get to high ground. Get a signal. Get out. Because if something went wrong and they couldn't call for help, no one would even know they were in trouble. Meals were another kind of challenge. They carried long-range patrol rations, freeze-dried food that could be eaten dry or rehydrated if water was available. The packages were light but tasted like dust. Beef hash, chicken stew, spaghetti. All of it was terrible. They chewed it down without speaking, often with filthy hands, sitting in the mud, eyes scanning the trees while chewing. Sometimes there wasn't even time to eat. If movement was urgent, rations stayed in the pack. Hunger became just another layer of pressure. Same with thirst. Water had to be rationed. Every sip was calculated. Some men drank nothing all day, choosing dehydration over running dry too early. Hygiene disappeared fast. After 3 or 4 days, everyone smelled like rot. Socks stayed wet, skin chafed raw, faces stayed unshaved, arms covered in mosquito bites, sweat rashes, mud. No one cared. Vanity didn't exist out there, only discomfort, and ways to minimize it enough to keep moving. Sleep came in fragments. A few minutes here, a short doze there. Always with boots on, rifle across the chest, finger near the trigger. 50% security meant half the team was always awake, the other half trying to rest without really letting go. Some never truly slept at all. They stayed in a semi-alert haze, eyes fluttering shut only to snap open at the sound of an insect, a branch, a whisper of wind. They dreamed with their eyes open. Hallucinations, déjà vu, time loops. After 5 or 6 days, time stopped making sense. Men forgot what day it was. Some forgot why they were even out there. Caffeine pills helped. So did adrenaline. So did fear. The longer the patrol went, the thinner the patience stretched. Tension grew. Tiny mistakes became huge risks. A misplaced footstep, a forgotten hand signal, a too loud whisper. Arguments sometimes happened, but quietly through gritted teeth, with eyes still on the jungle. They carried the weight of the mission, of each other, of the silence. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was pressure. When it lasted too long, it became paranoia. Was someone watching? Was the trail too quiet? Were they already compromised? When they stopped moving, they waited, always in a tight circle. Touch contact was essential, each man within arm's reach of the next. The radio in the center, weapons pointing out, no fires, no lights, no unnecessary noise. When it rained, they got wet. When it flooded, they moved through it. There was no dry place, no shelter, no relief. Just movement, listening, reporting, and waiting for the call that said the mission was over. Until then, they didn't relax. They didn't hope. They didn't think about extraction. They just endured. They trained for it, but nothing ever fully prepared them for the moment it happened. 1 second, the jungle was still. The next, it was chaos. A glint of light off metal, the crunch of a footstep, a startled shout in Vietnamese, and just like that, they were compromised. The reaction was immediate. The point man fired first, a short burst, a grenade if there was time, then moved. The man behind him repeated the action, leapfrogging past as the point reloaded. It was a well-drilled rhythm. Shoot, move, cover. No one hesitated. No one asked questions. Every second counted. There was no time to form plans. No time to call a meeting. The jungle turned into a blur of noise, gunfire, branches slapping faces, roots catching boots. The team fell back in pairs, bounding backward through undergrowth, laying down suppressive fire with each movement. The RTO screamed into the handset, trying to cut through the static. Coordinates, contact, emergency extraction. He gave the team's last known location and begged for gunships, artillery, anything. Sometimes help came. Helicopters thundered over the trees, miniguns and rockets clearing paths through thick jungle. Artillery roared from distant bases, shaking the ground. Other times, the only help was the men beside you, in the next ridge over. The NVA moved fast. They weren't always surprised for long. Once the LRRPs fired, the enemy responded aggressively, fanning out, trying to flank, cutting off trails. They knew the terrain. They used it well. They weren't reckless. They were good. A clean break was rare. Most withdrawals turned into running gunfights. There were times when the jungle felt alive with fire, AKs snapping from every direction, tree trunks splintering, grenade blasts echoing off ravines. The LRRPs moved like water, slipping between the cracks, never stopping. Each man knew his role. The point now became the rear. The rear took up the front. Every one of them had trained to lead, shoot, cover, and run. There was no rank in retreat, only execution. Extraction zones were rarely ideal. Often they had to make do with small breaks in the canopy, hilltops, dried creek beds. If a Huey couldn't land, it hovered, kicking up dust and leaves in a violent storm. The team popped smoke, usually colored, green, yellow, red, and waited for confirmation. If the pilot saw it, he came in. If not, they moved again. Sometimes the jungle was too tight. No space to land. That's when they dropped the ropes, McGuire rigs, simple harnesses that clipped under the arms. One by one, the men snapped in. As the helicopter lifted, they rose straight through the trees, swinging, dangling, totally exposed. You could hear the bullets. You could see them. Bright red tracers, snapping past your legs, thudding into branches. Some men were hit mid-air. Others were dropped on purpose, cut loose to save the bird. It was terrifying, but staying behind was worse. The fear wasn't dramatic. It was cold, focused, mathematical. If the enemy caught you, you were interrogated, tortured, maybe executed. There were stories, men tied to trees, beaten with bamboo, left to rot. No one wanted to be taken alive. So when the order came to move, they moved. And yet amid the noise, there were strange moments of stillness. Once a LRRP team came face to face with a small NVA recon unit on a narrow trail. Both sides froze, weapons raised, eyes locked. No one moved. The Americans waited for the enemy to fire. The NVA waited too. For a moment, everyone understood the truth. If anyone pulled the trigger, everyone would die. Slowly, one side lowered their rifles. The other did the same. Both teams backed away. It wasn't peace, it was professional calculation, mutual survival. But most encounters didn't end that way. Most ended with blood. After a contact, the team counted heads, checked wounds, repacked gear. Sometimes they left behind bodies, enemy or their own. Sometimes they carried them out. Sometimes they just marked the coordinates and moved on, faces blank. Debriefings were short. Sit down, report, sleep. The jungle didn't care what they had survived. It just waited to do it again. They didn't come home as units. There were no parades, no welcome ceremonies. One day they were in the jungle, soaked in sweat, covered in insect bites, eyes scanning tree lines. The next they were standing in airports, alone in clean clothes that didn't feel like theirs, listening to announcements over loudspeakers that made no sense. 24 hours. That's how long it took to go from firefights and emergency extractions to traffic lights in department stores. From life and death decisions to filling out customs forms, from counting enemy footfalls in the dark to counting change at a cash register. Their war ended without warning, and when it did, no one was waiting for them. There was no decompression, no time to process, no time to prepare. Just noise, smiles, neon, supermarkets full of food, people complaining about coffee orders, men their age talking about football, women looking through magazines, and no one, not a single person, understood where they had just come from. They didn't talk about it, couldn't. How do you explain the sound of a claymore mine at 10 feet? The smell of blood mixed with mud? The feeling of watching your teammate die because the helicopter couldn't carry you both? What words could describe the moment you lay still for hours, while NVA soldiers walked past you, close enough to touch? They tried. They talked to girlfriends, wives, parents, but their voices trailed off. Their stories didn't fit. They felt out of place even while speaking. So eventually they stopped talking. They got jobs, or tried to. Some lasted a few weeks. Others couldn't sit in an office without checking the exits. Fluorescent lights buzzed like radios. Phone rings spiked adrenaline. 4th of July fireworks felt like incoming mortars. Crowds made them twitch. Loud footsteps made their fingers curl as if reaching for a weapon. They didn't like sitting with their backs to the door. They didn't like being touched while asleep. They didn't like silence, but they couldn't bear noise either. No one saw them leave. No one heard them return. They moved without footprints, spoke in gestures, and breathed with the jungle. While the war raged in explosions and headlines, they slipped through the trees, silent, invisible, forgotten. 6 men alone in enemy territory, watching, waiting, vanishing. Their names weren't in the papers. Their victories left no captured hills, no flags planted in mud. But entire battles shifted because of what they saw. This isn't the story of glory. This is the story of ghosts. And like all ghost stories, it begins quietly. Some drank, not socially, aggressively. Others used whatever helped them sleep. Some didn't sleep at all. They lay in dark rooms, ceiling fans spinning, reliving every second of every patrol they ever went on. One wrong decision, one wrong sound, one friend who didn't make it out. That guilt never left. They asked themselves what they could have done differently. Could they have carried him faster? Should they have picked another trail? Did they miss a sign? The war kept playing in their heads, not in years, but in seconds. The 10-second firefight, the moment before contact, the last radio call before silence. The VA wasn't ready for them. PTSD wasn't a term yet. What they had was called combat fatigue or just nerves. Therapists who'd never seen war asked them how they felt. Felt? They didn't feel. they survived. Some got married, raised families, built lives that looked normal from the outside. But inside, the jungle stayed with them. They heard birds and thought about trail watchers. They saw wooded parks and checked for movement in the trees. They walked their kids to school and kept an eye on alleyways. They never fully came home. Only other LRRPs understood. They found each other years later, through letters, reunions. A phone number passed through a mutual friend. They met in VFW halls and hotel lobbies, sat down, said nothing for a minute, then started talking. The rhythm returned. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was understood. They shared stories, laughed, cried, remembered the ones who didn't make it back, the point man who caught the first burst, the RTO who stayed on the line until his last breath, the pilot who came in too low and never came out. At the wall in Washington, they traced the names, brought photos, dog tags, whiskey bottles, old letters. They pointed at names and whispered stories so the tourists could hear. They wanted someone, anyone, to know that these weren't just carved letters. They were men. They had jokes and flaws and futures. They could still see their faces. Time passed. The jungle receded, but never disappeared. They grew old in years, but part of them stayed young, forever 19 or 20, forever crawling through the mud with 5 others depending on them. They weren't looking for medals. They weren't chasing recognition. They just wanted to remember and not forget.